The M1 Ultra Mac Studio is by far the most powerful computer I have ever used, and it's a computer that I have been dreaming of for a very, very long time. You see, I've lived through at least a few Pro Macs during my day, and each one was unobtainable. When I started uploading regularly on the channel in 2017, one of the new computers that just hit the market was the 2017 iMac Pro, a sleek black aluminum all-in-one with a gorgeous 5K display, a revamped cooling system which amazed reviewers for its quiet operation and admirable power, and I wanted that computer so badly, but I couldn't afford it. Which is why I went for the trusty Retina 5K iMac at a much more affordable price point. But as years progressed, my channel grew more to where I could make stupider purchasing decisions. Thanks to the fine people like you watching my videos. Give yourself a round of applause. But still, even in 2019, Apple released a computer that was, again, out of my reach. The 2019 Intel Mac Pro. Apparently you people weren't watching enough back then. Apple was back in the desktop tower and display business, and I couldn't be happier. But I couldn't afford the combination of a Mac Pro and Apple's Pro Display XDR. Don't even get me started on that. And even if I could, the base model Mac Pro for $6,000, even when it launched in 2019, just seemed like a bad deal compared to what you could get on any of the iMacs. So again, I let another computer sail away into the moonlight. Well, flash forward to 2022, and you know what? The channel is doing better than ever. And what do you know? Apple released their most powerful computer ever, the M1 Ultra Mac Studio. And with some moderate success and a desire to review what might be considered now the most powerful Mac ever, I finally got my hands on the Mac Studio. Yes, I am in heaven, pure bliss. I have made it. I have made it to the top of the...
Marquez Brownlee, I made it. You can't stop me. Suck it, Dave Judy. Hasta la vista, like detectives. You're gonna need some therapy when I'm done with you, Lou. Mr. Who's the boss? More like Mr. Who's the employee. Snazzy Labs? Yeah, watching your videos is like pulling teeth. Maybe that's why you rented out a dentist's office.
Maybe I went too far. Not with that, I meant all that. But with this Mac Studio. Because purchasing this computer has made me realize that just because you can purchase the most powerful computer doesn't mean you should. And sometimes, too much of a good thing can be a costly mistake. Now you've probably seen some other videos covering the M1 Ultra Mac Studio, mostly because mine came in late and I'm also severely depressed, so getting on camera has been a little hard lately. But fighting through crippling depression, I'm here to tell you that some things are insanely impressive about this device. Before I bring it back down to reality and maybe shatter the dreams you once had. First, the M1 Ultra Mac Studio, in my honest Apple shilling opinion, is an absolute engineering marvel. It's clear when you first start running some benchmarks that this desktop is an absolute powerhouse in CPU performance. So much so that I even had to jump in front of this camera to record my astonishment with how fast the test was going during my Cinebench benchmark.
I just want to come on to say that I have never seen Cinebench light up that fast and fill out whatever these renders are, these little squares. I've never seen it just go that fast from start to finish. Okay. Listen, M1 Ultra, you got a 20-core CPU. You're doing this so quick. I know it's just a benchmark, but honestly, I've done this benchmark so many times on so many different Macs. The fact that it just did that, pretty crazy.
In multi-core performance, Apple Silicon's top-level chip, a first-generation M1 Ultra, was already the second highest scoring benchmark out of all the CPUs. The only one that beat it, a 64-core AMD chip, literally cost just as much money for the processor alone than a base model M1 Ultra Mac Studio. That's right, for around the same CPU performance as a Mac versus a PC, you get a whole computer. And that's maybe one of the first times I could say that in Mac history. The Mac is delivering better values, at least on paper, than a Windows computer. And that's pretty remarkable. However, the real feat of engineering is that it's doing this all in a computer that is this small compared to the massive PC desktops with these other chips that are inside of them. And it does it without getting significantly warm and without a significant ramp up in fan speeds. I can hold this Mac Studio over my head for like the whole video if I wanted to. Don't look at my flabby arms. I didn't say you could do that, but I could hold up this Mac Studio if I wanted to. And yeah, I don't think you could do that with a PC review. So what Apple is doing here, you just have to say, it's pretty remarkable. In GPU power, the Mac Studio is less impressive. Now, my model is the 48-core GPU. It's not the full 64-core GPU, so technically you could get a little bit more power. And in benchmarks like GFX Bench, it does okay, but it does not shine in some of the real-world test scenarios I've thrown at it, like playing games. And while Apple nailed the CPU, they haven't quite made an integrated GPU that can really take on NVIDIA's 3090 in raw power. But there's still something to be said about the amount of GPU power you can get out of the Mac Studio with its efficiency. Any other computer would have that huge presence and draw so much energy and heat that making that style of computer in this size would be impossible. All right, well, you made it this far into the video. You're probably wondering, well, Greg, CPU-wise, it seems to be a pretty impressive machine, and even though the GPU didn't necessarily deliver on the performance of a 3090, it's still impressive for the size of the computer, and it's better than your MacBook Pro, right? Well, what's the problem? Well, listen, in my pro work, if you can even call it that, I mean, you made it this far into the video, so you know this isn't exactly the shining content of Tech YouTube, but my work consists of editing this dribble into Final Cut Pro, and the video timeline, as we call it in the biz, is buttery smooth. But it's also smooth on my M1 Max MacBook Pro and on the M1 Max Mac Studio I tested earlier. So I thought, okay, let's test some export times. This is where I will see the true power of the M1 Ultra, and I'll just be able to export instantly. Well, no. Because in both my export tests, one with H.264 and one with ProRes footage, the same tests I've been running for the last few videos, even with my M1 Max Mac Studio versus the M1 Mac Mini, took that same footage, did an export on it, and let me tell you, the M1 Ultra, it was fast, right? No, it was the same exact speed as an M1 Max Mac Studio. M1 Ultra, with all those extra cores, export it both in H.264 and in ProRes. It's just a 12-minute clip, but it exported exactly the same as my usual workflow. In both instances, if I didn't make that clear enough. Granted, the footage I work with is off of a Sony camera, so there's a lot of different types of footages out there. I would point you to the Max Tech YouTube channel, where they did a comprehensive benchmark going over both the M1 Ultra Mac Studio and the M1 Max Mac Studio, and in some of their tests, like I think they were dealing with Canon 8K RAW or something like that, they did notice some speed improvements with export times on the Mac Studio, but when they were using my type of footage, again, I think they reached a similar result where they weren't really seeing any speed improvements. And to top it all off, Apple's own internal testing for the speed improvements they tout it with Final Cut Pro was done on a pre-release version of Final Cut Pro that is not available yet to the general public. So I want to fully acknowledge that yes, perhaps with some updates, my own tests could actually see some speed improvements in the future, and maybe this video becomes less relevant, but for now I have to review it as is, and I can only wonder that maybe I actually did make a $7,000 mistake when I made that thumbnail a little while ago, and it wasn't clickbait. It was prolific. Listen, I'll say it again. The Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra, it's a beast. It's an amazing desktop computer that fits in tremendous power into its small size. It has a great port array, and it's kind of the desktop I always dreamed about owning from Apple. And while up until this point I have been blown away by every single M1 chip that Apple has released, I think this time I ran into the wall of diminishing returns with my own workflow. The M1 Max in my 14-inch MacBook Pro already felt limitless with what it could do, and I never hit those hard ceiling limits that I did on the first M1 machines. So while I dreamed for a long time about owning a pro computer, I think this M1 Ultra Mac Studio really isn't for me. And it's offered, at least in my week of using it, no real noticeable benefits. Does this mean the M1 Ultra Max Studio is a bad computer? No, I mean, people who bought the $6,000 Mac Pro, they bought a bad computer. And this thing at $4,000 runs circles around that machine, and the machine you can get at $2,000 does too. But if you're like me and you used to envy the benchmarks of these computers and wonder what would happen if you had one, it's very likely that you won't be able to utilize it to its full potential. If you take advantage of it, more power to you. I literally mean, yeah, more power to you if you can actually take advantage of it. But I think if you're more like me, I think the valuable lesson here is this. The transition to Apple Silicon made one thing clear. You don't have to spend a lot of money on a Mac to get good performance. The M1 chip is a revolution, and it changed the Mac forever, resulting in lower cost machines that punch way above their weight class. This tuning and optimization led to a significant jump in performance that, while it continues with the M1 Ultra, it also affects the least amount of users, and I include myself as one of them. Now, while you may take this as a negative, I don't think you should. At the end of the day, all of these M1 chips are built off the same architecture, and their clock speed has not changed since 2020. Adding more cores can help some workflows, but for most people, stronger individual cores will actually lead to a notable increase in performance. It's why, even as powerful as the M1 Ultra is, it isn't the peak of Apple Silicon. I'm not saying that this is the peak and Apple can't release a stronger computer that I will start to notice some of the benefits for, because they absolutely can. But they have to make a jump in the next generation of Apple Silicon. They have to increase the clock speed, because for most people, waiting for an M2 or an M2 Pro or Max with higher clock speed, higher single-threaded performance will lead to the performance gains they are seeking. And that is a very, very good thing, because it means for so many more people out there buying at the lower prices, an M2 or an M2 Pro would not only be the better computer for those users, but it would also save you money. So take a lesson from me. Avoid my mistake, save your money, and use some of that saved money to buy Apple's excellent studio display. Yeah, I went there. I went there. Well, I don't have a good way to end this video. So let me leave you with one of my favorite poems. I'm only laughing on the outside. My smile is just skin deep. If you can see inside, I'm really crying. You might join me for a week.